Welcome to Our Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn, and I'll be your host for the next few weeks as we revel in our culture, as we talk about our region, and we'll have a variety of guests to share our enthusiasm for the region with you. I was born in Appalachian, Alabama, reared, I guess, in Appalachian, Tennessee, and most of my adult life has been in Appalachian, Kentucky. So you will have to understand that I not only appreciate the region, I'm very excited about the region, and hopefully that enthusiasm for our homeland will show through in this series. We have a very interesting topic today. It deals really with the whole concept of Appalachia. A lot of people use the term to refer to different activities, to refer to different parts of the country, but oftentimes we take a lot for granted. What is Appalachia? Exactly what does the term mean, and from whence came the term? Well, we have an authority here today. Indeed, he is a geographer who is not only well-versed in geography, but he himself is an Appalachian. He's from Appalachian, Virginia. Our guest is Dr. Gary Cox. He is head of the geography department here at Morehead State University. He received both baccalaureate and master's degrees here at Morehead State University, did a doctorate then at the University of Northern Colorado, came back to us, and has done a fantastic job in our geography department since returning to the region. Welcome to our show.
Very happy to be here.
Since Gary Cox and I are good friends, I'm going to take the liberty of calling him Gary, and we're going to talk about the region from a variety of perspectives. I should mention to you that Gary was born and reared on a small hill farm at the head of a hollow near Pound, Virginia. And in the 50s, he left the region, as many Appalachians did, to try to earn a few more dollars elsewhere, but has maintained his love for the region, his knowledge of the region, and teaches a course at Morehead State University called Appalachian Geography, which is one of the most popular courses here on campus. But we are pleased to discuss this topic today. Of course, I guess, Gary, when you talk about Appalachia, you have to start off as a geographer with a very basic definition that a geographer might call a physiographic definition, which has to do with the region as it might appear on a map, whether a road map or a topographic map. Why don't you give us just a basic definition of the Appalachian region in what you might call physiographic terms?
Well, the term Appalachia, in terms of physiography, is a rather broad term. In some ways, I guess you could say it includes all of the uplifted portion of the eastern United States. However, it's been subdivided, most geographers and geologists subdivided into about 7 major subregions or physiographic provinces. It would include almost anything from, in fact, it would include anything from the fall line in the Piedmont all the way over to the western edge of the Pottsville Escarpment along through eastern Kentucky and on up through Ohio and down the other way in Tennessee and Alabama. It would, from a physical viewpoint, it would also include such things as the Adirondack Mountains in New York, the New England Highlands, the St. Lawrence Lowlands. But for most of us, those things are not really Appalachia. And most geographers that deal with Appalachia tend to include 4 physiographic regions or physiographic provinces or sub-provinces within their concept of Appalachia. And this would include the Piedmont province from the fall line over to the base of the Blue Ridge. It would also include the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Ridge and Valley section, including the Shenandoah and the half a dozen or so valleys to the west of the Shenandoah. And it would include, as a 4th province, the Appalachian Plateaus, which are usually divided into a Cumberland Plateau in the south and an Allegheny Plateau in the north.
You're actually then talking about a huge region so far as the amount of ground that's covered when you talk about the Appalachian region in its totality. I guess that stands to reason. As a kid, we often heard about the Appalachian Trail. I was always intrigued by the trail because I heard you could hike all the way from Maine down to North Georgia and still be on a single trail. A trail, I understand, that runs about 1,000 miles. Now, a lot of definitions of Appalachia definitely don't take in Maine, but you say even that area, the mountainous part of Maine, is in this basic chain or range of mountains that we call the Appalachian Mountains.
Yes, if we take the broad physiographic definition and say Appalachian Highlands, it would include a strip about 1,200 miles long and with a width that varies from a few miles in the north to as much as almost 400 miles from Virginia Piedmont over to eastern Kentucky.
We're talking about a huge population base then in the
Yes, we
Appalachian
are.
region. How many people would you say live in what is generally called the Appalachian region in its entirety at this point?
If you include only the portion south of the Mohawk Trench, which we normally do call
Right.
Appalachia, you'd have somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 million people.
I see.
But if you put in the western portion of New England, the Adirondacks, and St. Lawrence lowlands, you would add another million or so to that.
Okay, but
So-
now when you talk about the Mohawk Trench, you're talking pretty far north, aren't you? You're talking there about New York State?
Yes.
Okay. But let's get a little closer to home now. We, of course, consider ourselves to be Kentuckians, Southerners, in addition to being Appalachians. So when people speak of the Southern Mountains or the Southern Highlands, what do you think they're speaking of, basically, in physiographic terms?
I think we need to qualify, first of all, what do we mean when we say Appalachian Highlands or Appalachian Mountains or Southern Appalachians? From a strictly technical viewpoint, the only mountainous portion of the Appalachians would be the Blue Ridge. The southern Blue Ridge especially is quite mountainous. But when someone says the Southern Highlands or the Southern Appalachians, they almost invariably mean not only the southern Blue Ridge south of the Roanoke River, but they also include in that the Cumberland Plateau, the southern portions of the Appalachian Plateau.
Okay, so what you're saying is if you really want to be strict in terms of topography, in terms of elevations, the Blue Ridge Mountains are high enough to be considered mountains, but if you wanted to be picky, you could even say that the hills we live in, which are a part of the Cumberland Plateau or the Cumberland Mountains, are not that high in terms of elevations across the country.
Yes, of course, definitions are all man-made things.
Right.
But from a strict view of what is a mountain, there are only two mountains in the state of Kentucky, Big Black Mountain and then the Pine Mountain, which forms part of the Virginia border.
If you're really putting a lot of emphasis on the high elevation. Okay, so it stands to reason that some people might be Appalachian who are not mountaineers in one sense of the word. So the terms are used interchangeably, but I guess there are cases where they're not interchangeable. Along that same line, I hear of a lot of cities and indeed areas that are hilly but not what I would call mountainous. Areas like Knoxville, Tennessee, or Bristol, Kingsport, Johnson City area of Tennessee. They're referred to as Appalachian, but really the countryside is rolling. You do have ridges and hills, but you certainly don't have anything like the Great Smoky Mountains.
That's right.
What part of Appalachia is this, or is it really Appalachian?
Well, depends on what definition we want to apply, but the Region Valley section, the portion of Appalachia that lies between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the edge of the Appalachian Plateaus, is made up of a long series of parallel valleys that are flat-floored and quite fertile and have pretty good access to the outside world. And those valley towns, if you go all the way back up to York, Pennsylvania, and come down through Hagerstown, Frederick and Hagerstown, and down to Virginia towns, Winchester, Lexington, Roanoke, all the way down to Knoxville, and go on further south into Birmingham. Those are all Appalachian cities.
Mm-hmm.
But I dare say you would have trouble getting some people living there to admit they're Appalachian.
Right. Well, I'm sure they don't know it because they've never approached it in these physiographic terms. And of course, a lot of folks feel that being urban precludes being Appalachian. Seems a lot of people talk of Appalachia as if it's basically a rural phenomenon. And that is not necessarily true. There are indeed Appalachian cities, given your broad physiographic definition then.
Yes.
Right.
From that or from a socioeconomic viewpoint.
Right. It reminds me of a story I've heard of a fellow named Chester Cornett back in the 60s. He's from East Kentucky, and he was up in Cincinnati, Ohio. Chester's a fantastic chair maker. He's not living any longer, but he made these massive rockers of native woods, and he made the bottoms out of hickory splints and different types of barks from Appalachian trees. Anyway, Chester all of a sudden was catapulted into the role of being a spokesman for the mountains. He was up in Cincinnati trying to sell some chairs, and this very glib Cincinnati radio announcer came up and said, "And Mr. Cornett, how does it feel to be an Appalachian?" Well, Chester kind of backed off a little and said, "You know, I've heard that word, but now I can't rightly figure out where it is or what you're really talking about. Now, me, I'm from Perry County, Kentucky." And the point is that this term Appalachian is used very often by scholars, more and more by government officials, more and more by those of us who live in the region. But it is a term that has not always been known or used in mountain areas. I think in eastern Kentucky, for example, people refer to themselves as being Eastern Kentuckians. They certainly refer to themselves in terms of being from the county where they were born and reared. But in my observation, it's only in recent years that Eastern Kentucky people have come to realize that Appalachians are the people in this part of the country by many, many definitions. Let's get into another definition now. There are a lot of characteristics of the Appalachian region beyond the topographic definitions or the physiographic definitions. What about the geology of the region? Why is it that some people think of the Appalachian region as being a region given to coal mining? Other people who consider themselves Appalachian think more of an agrarian culture and know very little about coal mining. Is there variation in these mountains so far as the rock formations or the geological strata that underlie the surface?
Very definitely so. If we take these four major subdivisions that we were talking about, the Piedmont, the Blue Ridge, the Region Valley, and the Appalachian Plateaus, one could divide it into two parts. You could say that the Blue Ridge and the Western Piedmont are made up of ancient crystalline rock that are quite different from those that are found over in the Region Valley and the Plateaus. In fact, some geologists and some physical geographers refer to the eastern two provinces as the old Appalachians, or the older Appalachians, and the western portion as the newer Appalachians. All are old, but there's a difference in age here. And in the sedimentary areas to the west, when you get over into the Appalachian Plateaus and also in the Region Valley, you have rocks that are primarily sedimentary, and some of those rocks are organic shales, some are bituminous coal. And this has given a whole different flavor to the culture of the region. I'm not an environmental determinist. I don't believe that environment necessarily determines activity. But it's not possible to mine coal in the Blue Ridge because there isn't any. And people have different views about the Appalachians. Those who think of Appalachia as including the Blue Ridge or the very southern portions of the Appalachians are primarily talking about an Appalachia that's quite rural in nature, agrarian, or was agrarian. It's increasingly less so. And of course, in our portion of the Appalachian, in the last 70 years, it's been associated very much with coal mining. And because of the difficulties that have come out of mining in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people who talk about Appalachia or who view Appalachia as only those portions which mine coal. And here we're talking about primarily just the Appalachian Plateaus and certain counties in the plateau.
Right. So the terms Appalachian living and coal mining certainly aren't synonymous, are they?
Not at all.
In western North Carolina, for example, very beautiful mountainous region of Appalachia, there's hardly any coal mining. It's my understanding.
In fact, there isn't any.
Right, right. Might be a few other gems, but no coal mining. Well, let's very quickly go to some other definitions. Much of my training is in sociology. And beyond the physiographic definition of the region, I'm intrigued by certain cultural definitions of Appalachia. And I would like for you to tell me what the Appalachian culture is from your perspective. Or is there such a thing as Appalachian culture? Do we truly have a unique culture in the mountain region? If so, what is the reason for its distinctiveness?
Well, that's a difficult one to answer. In some ways, I guess you could say that Appalachia is distinctive from other parts of the country. There are certain traits or certain remnants of a former culture that still linger on here, which give Appalachia a flavor that's its own. We have a regional accent which is readily identifiable. We have certain cultural traits that still carry over from an earlier time. I really think of Appalachian culture as being if there's anything distinctive about it, it's that we have a culture that was more or less common to the American frontier in the early days of the frontier and was perpetuated in the Appalachian Highlands. And what we're talking about when we say Appalachian culture, I think, is simply remnants of a frontier culture which lingered on in the Appalachian Highlands far beyond the time when they had passed on elsewhere.
So since you're speaking of remnants of a frontier culture, you're really saying that the culture of Appalachia might result from what an anthropologist would call a cultural lag, where we really think and live in many ways like frontier persons did, or at least that was true, let's say, at the turn of the century in certain parts of the area. Were there differences, though, by virtue of the ethnic origins of Southern Mountain people? Where did Southern Mountain people come from? Did they bring cultures with them that were truly ethnic cultures that tended to predominate in the Southern Mountain region as distinct from other parts of the country?
I think there is more or less general agreement on among Appalachian scholars that the Appalachian Highland region, or the Southern Highlands at least, were settled by a fairly homogeneous people. If you go back and look at our background, we really come from about 4 different ethnic groups. It's hard to say which is dominant. There's a lot of argument about that. The Scotch-Irish certainly played a role in it. They were found all over the American frontier. The English, who were in no way really related to the Scotch-Irish in the sense of a cultural or an ethnic group, were in the Southern Blue Ridge perhaps before the Scotch-Irish, and they have also provided a certain element throughout the whole Appalachian region. We also have a very sizable people of a German Protestant background, and there is a sprinkling through the Southern Highlands of a people that you could best call French Huguenot, I guess.
I see. But I guess most of our ethnic origin does come from the British Isles, you say France, perhaps, Germany. Very few Scandinavians, though, or Eastern Europeans settled in this area early on. I guess that could be said of the entire United States, for that matter.
Yes, in fact, I think today, if you want to talk about one characteristic of Appalachia that is distinctive perhaps from the rest of the country, it's the fact that we have a homogeneous population that has not really included many other ethnic groups other than the 4 I mentioned. Today, if you very carefully study the population of the Big Sandy Basin, you would find that just by trying to trace back family names, you would find that there is very little evidence of mixing from other groups. There was a time when we had some Polish or East European miners in the region, but they were the first laid off in the 30s and they never came back. And today, if there is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population in America, it's in the Appalachians. I don't want to get into this thing about saying that we are pure Anglo-Saxon, we're not pure anything.
Right.
But we are about as homogeneous a group of people as you will find.
Right. This gets me to a question that I'd like to treat very briefly. We've talked about the physiographic definition of the region and the cultural definition. To what extent do you feel there is a relationship between the two? In other words, to what extent has the lay of the land, the nature of the topography, or even the geology interacted with the cultural situation in creating what might be a distinctive culture?
Well, one's never really on safe ground to talk about influences of environment on human behavior, physical environment. However, you have to admit that environment makes certain things possible or makes certain things impossible. One doesn't mind coal in the Blue Ridge because there isn't any coal. And there is a considerable amount of relationship, you could say today, in the evolution of Appalachian culture and the environment in which it developed. For instance, much of what we talked about as being Appalachian culture, and I mean saying that it was a remnant of frontier culture, was made possible, or in fact was probably almost inevitable because of certain characteristics of the land. In the Southern Blue Ridge and also in the Appalachian Plateaus, there are only habitable pockets of land. The land is not continuously useful. And when you have small pockets that are arable, small pockets that can be cultivated, this tended to group people into little pockets that were isolated from each other. And before the coming of modern highways, we had these little clusters that were more or less isolated, and there was no unifying thing and nothing really to pull them together. So we developed or retained certain things that we called Appalachian.
Right. Well, I'd like to chase a lot of these ideas you're throwing up, because I have been told by many scholars that while the Southern Mountain people were truly frontier people, and a lot of the distinctiveness relates to the holding of these frontier traditions, that there are some differences in attitudes, even in the beginning, from, say, the plantation culture of the Old South and mountain culture. These things I'd love to get into, and we might get back to them, but let me ask you very quickly about another definition of the region, which relates maybe to attitudes and relates maybe to the changes in regional images. What about the political definition of Appalachia? In my opinion, a lot of people who'd never heard the term Appalachia were introduced to it in the 60s, the 70s, during what we call the War on Poverty era. And let me throw something in here real quickly. You know, you say Appalachia, I say Appalachia. For the first time in my life, I heard a pronunciation during the 60s, Appalachia. I still have to work to even say it. And I find that thanks to Walter Cronkite and other commentators, more and more individuals, even in the region, are saying Appalachia rather than Appalachia. I'd always heard the Appalachian Trail, Appalachia, Virginia, Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, and now I'm trying to learn to say Appalachia. I don't know that I should try. What is the correct pronunciation, or is there one?
I think we're safest in saying there probably isn't. I never heard the word Appalachia until I was 25 years old.
Right.
When I was a youngster growing up, we always referred to it as Appalachia, Appalachia, Virginia, or the Appalachian Highlands. And I suppose either pronunciation is correct.
But I think in the southern mountains, we have tended to say Appalachia if you go back before the 60s. Wouldn't you say that's correct?
Well, I tend to say that. I tend to look at it this way. I think people who are from Appalachia call it Appalachia.
Right,
people who are not from Appalachia sometimes call it Appalachia.
And maybe they've got the TV networks, and maybe we're learning from them, but I'm sure that either pronunciation is quite all right. Let's talk about the political definition, though. The government entered the scene, so far as Appalachian concerns, way back. As a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln made a lot of statements after the Civil War about the needs in the region. But I guess with the creation of the President's Appalachian Regional Commission in the early 60s, we had a recent emphasis on regional development in the Appalachian portion of our country. So take us from that point and tell us what Appalachia is from the perspective of a government official, say. How is the region defined and why?
Well, you remember with pretty much the collapse of the coal industry at the beginning of the 50s, that the coal mining portions of the southern highlands, or the coal mining portion of Appalachia in general, including West Virginia and Pennsylvania, lapsed quickly into really a hair-raising depression. It was no recession. It was a depression that was the worst that the region ever experienced, and it lasted from about 1950 till about 1965. It was during that period when the United States, everything in the United States was prospering. I guess we were coming into the affluent society, but America slowly began to realize about 1952 or 3 that there was a part of America that was not getting well, a part of America that was not prospering with the rest. We were dragging behind. And we went through a period of rediscovery of an Appalachian region, or a portion of the region, that became stamped into people's mind as Appalachia. It was the coal mining sections. And this first got the attention, I think, of Jack Kennedy when he was running for the presidency, when he was in West Virginia. And shortly after he was president, he set out to do something about Appalachia's poverty, and one of the first things to come out of that was first a study commission on Appalachia, and then the Appalachian Regional Development Act. And in creating a political division, it was necessary, if we're going to attack Appalachia's problems, we first had to define just what is Appalachia. And so we came up with a political definition which was quite different from the physiographic definition or from the cultural definition. And at the time this thing was being organized, this political Appalachia, the governors of the various states, or the political forces in the various states, got into the act. And it was to the advantage of any state to get as many counties as possible into Appalachia. So when the governors and the political forces in the states were asked, what do you want to include in Appalachia? They put in as many counties as they could. And we were very successful in Kentucky in that we got about 49 counties in.
Right. In fact, it stretches your imagination to realize that by political definition, of course, you're either in or you're out. And Clark County, Kentucky, for example, is in. Even as far west as Greene County, Kentucky, down in the south central portion of the state. But we do have 49 counties, you say.
And some of them have a little bit of hill land along the fringes
Right.
of them. But if you had any hill land at all, you could call it Appalachian.
Right.
And one of the anomalies to come out of this was that in order to get the Mississippi delegation in Congress to go along with it, we had to include about 13 counties in Mississippi.
So there's an Appalachian Mississippi.
Yes.
I'm sure that Mississippi people had never thought of themselves as Appalachian until they were told that that was advantageous in terms of getting federal dollars. Of course, some of us are hard put to realize that there is a northern Appalachia. We think of the term as being distinctively southern, and a lot of people feel that New York, the state of New York, and Appalachia, if anything, are anonyms. But indeed, there is an Appalachian New York, I guess, from every definition, whether physiographic, cultural, or political.
Even southern tier states, southern tier counties.
Right, right. The political definition of the region really fascinates me, and certainly all of the coverage that the region received during the 60s, because in my opinion, a lot of the images of Appalachia are distorted. Certainly they don't represent the totality of the Appalachian experience. What do you feel about this political interest in the region, and particularly about the national interest that related to war on poverty programs? Do you feel that there are a lot of socioeconomic notions or images about the region that are not necessarily accurate?
Yes, I believe that Appalachia is probably the most poorly understood region in the United States in terms of how other people view it. We've been stereotyped every way you could stereotype us. And I'm afraid that the image that the world has, or the greater country and the world has of Appalachia, is one of coal mining and poverty and backwardness.
Right.
And like all stereotypes, there's just enough truth in those things to make them believable.
Right.
But they're far from the actual Appalachia.
Right. Well, Gary, I certainly do thank you. I think we've gotten good and started on defining the region, and I hope that the people who've been with us by way of TV understand the region a little more fully, and we hope you can be back with us. We've just scratched the surface on a lot of topics. Thank you very much for being with us. We hope you'll be back next week on Our Appalachia as we discuss another interesting facet of our region.